Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anitra Henry, and I am the Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Institute for Public Relations. Race in the PR Classroom is presented by the Institute for Public Relations and the PR Educators Academy. Joining me today is our guest special moderator, Dr. Meta Carstarphen from the University of Oklahoma. I would also like to recognize our sponsor, the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you so much for supporting Race in the PR Classroom. IPR and the PRSA Educators Academy have been partnering on the Race in the PR Classroom since June of 2020. In that time, we have featured primarily Black, Indigenous, people of color leaders talking about race in the PR classroom. Today, we will be discussing the Indigenous perspective on PR and storytelling inside and outside of the classroom. I would like to first welcome Candace Hamana, the owner of Badger PR and the founder of the Indigenous Peoples Public Relations Association. We also welcome April Tinhorn, the Chief Connector and CEO of Tinhorn, a training and marketing company. We will also welcome Dr. Dustin Tahmahkera from the University of Oklahoma later in today's session. Last but not least, again, our special guest moderator is Dr. Meta Carstarphen, a professor and faculty member in the strategic communication area of the Gaylord College of Journalism and Communication at the University of Oklahoma. Thank you all so much for being here and sharing your personal experience with us. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping rules. This is a Q&A type forum. To ask a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your virtual hand. Once you're called upon, please remember to state your name and your organization. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, please type the message to the host in the chat and we will read your question aloud. Only the moderators can see your question, so you will remain anonymous. Today's session will be recorded and will be available for playback in the next 48 hours. Lastly, please remain respectful to all of our hosts and others on the call by keeping yourself muted at all times unless you intend to speak or ask a question. Dr. Carstarphen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Anitra Henry. You are an expert and just are so welcoming, and we appreciate you inviting us into this space for this special program. I gave you an extra credential you earned. So again, I'm thrilled and honored to participate in today's discussion and dialogue about Indigenous voices in public relations. By way of introduction, let me offer this greeting and land acknowledgement as I greet you from Norman, Oklahoma, and the University of Oklahoma. Long before the University of Oklahoma was established, the land on which OU now resides was the traditional home of the Caddo Nation and Wichita and affiliated tribes. I acknowledge that this territory also once served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations dwell in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler and colonial policies that were designed to assimilate and, in some cases, exterminate Native people. But in recognizing this history, I also embrace the vibrant presence and impact of Native cultures today. As a teacher and scholar, I honor this important legacy by learning and sharing knowledge about our shared histories in classes and research. And that is why I am here today. Each of our esteemed guests will begin our seminar by offering a personal introduction as well as a brief story about how they came to do the work that they do currently. As you know, the theme of our meeting today is Indigenous voices in public relations. I will again just do a brief acknowledgement of our panelists. And as was mentioned, one of them is in class, so he will be joining us later. So we will begin our conversation first with Ms. Candace Hamana. She, as was mentioned, is the founder of Indigenous Peoples Public Relations Association and the principal for Badger PR. Badger PR is based in Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm going to have her talk about what the stated mission is and what her journey has been. Candace.
Hi, good morning. In Hopi, we say Nakwang Talongva. That means good day. Candace Hamana Yanmatsiwa Hanangwa. That means my name is Candace Hamana and I am from the Badger clan, hence the name Badger PR. When I started the company. Thank you so much to all the organizations present today who helped put this important discussion on. I'm so honored to be a speaker. I have been in communications now for over 15 years in PR and in stakeholder relations, tribal communications, but my start actually, interestingly enough, began back in South Carolina when I was working with local political races, both at the state level and then also for the primary and the general in South Carolina in 2008. At that time that Senator Barack Obama was running for his presidency. And because South Carolina was a very important, decisive victory for him to become the candidate, it was really exciting to be on the ground. I think that's when I first sort of really experienced the exhilaration of stepping into that power, having a voice, being able to work directly with communities, obviously public speaking, and being engaged in a way that really helped develop messages that resonated with people, with voters. And I just thought, wow, this is really awesome that I can work like this in South Carolina, but how cool would it be if I could go home to Arizona and do the same thing for my people? And I think that's kind of what I threw out into the universe back then. And when I came home from Arizona, I was pretty clear about taking my talent and my knowledge and my skill set from all the years of the PR work and bringing it back home to our Indigenous communities. And I think that seeing that part of my dream and how that's kind of manifested into reality has just been the biggest blessing and gift, that I get to wake up every morning and do the work that I love and have an impact to change the communities that I belong to, but also to Indigenous communities across, the country and the world. Our footprint in Indigenous communications and the impact we make resonates across all tribal and Indigenous nations around the world, is what I'm finding. Through the years, people have reached out and have told me about the work that I'm doing and that they see and that the information we're sharing, and they're so inspired. And so I'm just happy to do that work through my business. Badger PR, our mission is to be a champion and a voice for hyperlocal, brave, and diverse communities. And I feel that I get the blessing and the joy to reach clients and work with them in a way that feels truly authentic to the way that I like to work and connect with people and with other communities of color, but especially Indigenous communities. So thank you again so much. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you so much. And everybody, let's show a digital appreciation for our first speaker's introduction. Next, I am delighted to briefly introduce Ms. April Tinhorn. She is Chief Connector and CEO of Tinhorn consultant. It's headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona, and it describes itself as a full-service integrated marketing and consulting firm with a focus on helping others connect with Indigenous communities. I also hope that Ms. Tinhorn will explain the meaning of that name and her name. Thank you very much. April.
Hanke, Dr. Carstarphen, Gamia, Nyamal April Tinhorn, Nixitga, Nyawal Baiwamui Chanum. Hello, my name is April Tinhorn, and I'm Wallapai, Navajo, and Chinese. And first of all, I should say thank you, Candace, for those on the call. You need to find you a Candace in your circle, because she's like not only uplifting, you know, her community, but she's also taking other like Native business owners and artists, creators with her. So thank you for the invitation to be in this circle and this space, because it's not, you're my in, I guess I should say. So I wanted to share a story about relationships, stories, and identities. And so like I go back to like second grade, and I am a product of public education on the Wallapai Reservation, which is the southwest rim of the Grand Canyon. We're one of the 22 federally recognized tribes here in Arizona. And so little second grade April, I've always loved relationships with others. I like to create community. I love stories. I love people. I love sharing mine, but more importantly, I love listening and receiving yours. And so back then we used to take our little desks, and our teacher had us push it into like groups of 6 to make tables. And so I went and I used to finish my homework early, and then I'd pass it to the table, and I'd tell everybody like, go ahead, you know, copy it, because I want to, like, we're going to play like once we get our homework in, right? So I guess this went on for like 2 months. And so I was getting in trouble for it, for passing my paper around, and because we were disruptive, you know, we're having fun and telling our stories and playing with each other. And so my teachers, solution to that was that they were going to advance me up to 3rd grade. So, you know, that was my first lesson about about relationships and stories, that like I got in trouble for it, and bless you. And then I also think you know, like maybe that was to see how I would handle it, but I, you know, I did. And so just kind of like keeping moving with my life story about that is that was also my first instance of who I was being reflected by others, you know, in terms of identity. I shared with you that I'm Wallapai. I'm an enrolled member with Wallapai. I'm biracial, you know, Chinese and also Navajo. And so I grew up on the Wallapai Reservation, and that being biracial then was not, you know, back then we were like less than 2,000 enrolled members. And being biracial wasn't necessarily a commonality. So, you know, it was already being mirrored back to me that being other wasn't necessarily something that was good. So keep moving also was mirrored back to me, like, you're really smart. So then what I was told by others was like, you should be an engineer. And I should also say that I'm a reformed computer scientist turned business owner. So that's why, Candace, I was like, it's interesting to be in this circle, but there's connection of why I'm here. So, you know, I went the route of computer science, and I had different people who, teachers, advisors, you know, because like checkmark things like you're Native American, you know, I'm talking about, I graduated high school in 92. So, you know, they're like, you're a woman, you're a person of color, you're going into like STEM. They're like, there were all these opportunities. And so I went and took those opportunities because, being biracial, growing up on the Wallapai Reservation, I wasn't really sure like who I was. So that's a whole nother probably conversation. But I just want to share kind of some of the highlights. Then, you know, it's interesting that I loved hearing about other people's culture, and I love traveling. And I found out kind of on an off chance, like, oh, if I run for like Miss Teen Wallapai, I get to be an ambassador and share my story, and I get to go into other communities and learn about yours. So like that was like my entryway into the pageant realm, probably for like the next 8 years, like from I was blessed to be able to serve as our Miss Wallapai, our Miss Indian Arizona Teen. I got to represent my university. I was Miss Indian Arizona State University. And I love those opportunities, just to give people background. It's not like your mainstream pageants. There's no like buckskin bikinis or anything going on in these pageants. It's more about, you really serve as an ambassador of your people. And I did not know that that was helping me acquire skills that I utilize and help my clients today. The ability to adapt to, you show up and to an event and you're supposed to be like a guest, and then they tap you on the shoulder and they're like, our keynote speaker or our entertainment didn't show up, so like, can you kill time for the next 7 minutes, like get on stage, like sure. So like kind of learn how to do that whole being on what they call it, like being that duck on water and you can't see their little legs underneath. But those were all things that, like being able to read an audience. All those things were applicable to, being a business owner. And so I was, like I said, I did get my bachelor's and undergraduate degrees in computer science. First, my bachelor's was from Arizona State University, and then I got my master's from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. And that's where another mirror came about, because a lot of people I met, they were like, I've never met a Native American before, and I applaud. I always remember this one guy, Jay, because we used to play spades, and he was asking me, he was just like, honestly, he's like, I remember reading about you guys in history books. He goes, but I didn't think you guys still existed. And he was like, so can I ask you some questions? He's like, I feel so ignorant and so bad about this. He goes, but really, I didn't think you guys existed anymore. And he's like, do you live in a teepee? Do you have running water? He would, do you hunt buffalo? These were, and like young 20-something April, kind of wanted to snap back on that, but I have to always take a pause and remember, like, people only know what they know, right? And if this is your first encounter, like, I'm not sure here on the call, if this is your first encounter with Native Americans, you might have whatever public media has, or what you learned in school, that might be your idea of what we are. But there's been many instances like that throughout my life. I've been so blessed to be able to travel internationally, like speaking about indigenous economies out in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia at their International Women's Conference, or being like the first of 2 indigenous fellows at the International Center for Assigned Names and Numbers, like their conference out in Hyderabad, India. And I always try to walk and be in the culture and take in all the food, the people, the stories, and be respectful of it. Learn a little bit about how to not be a horrible guest in someone else's country and in someone else's land. And I've heard that kind of was one of the questions here. It's kind of like the same if you've ever traveled abroad. I know for me, I'll always like read up about culture of the country I'm going into, because I don't want to be that stereotypical, ugly American tourist. And it's kind of the same thing when you think about when you want to create relationships with Native Americans as well. 574 federally recognized tribes, which are governments, each unique on their own language, their own legal structures, our own beliefs. It's kind of like if you think about China and all their different indigenous peoples with all their dialects. It's similar to that. Like, it's not just Chinese. So kind of like, just to give you maybe some context as we start going deeper into this. But I just really wanted to share that how I ended up in this sort of, in your space, I guess your professional space, is that I did eventually start my own company, and it was based on value decisions different tribal organizations were asking back in the early 2000s, we want to support a Native American web developing company, but we haven't been able to find them. And so even though I wasn't by any means trying to have my own business, I was, working, I worked for IBM and like Indian Health Service and others. I started to do that type of work on the side. And that led to, because there was that need, I started my company. And another thing in working with tribal peoples and entities is trust is huge. And then once I had the trust, the clients started asking me, so what else does Tinhorn Consulting do? And that's how we ended up adding in more of our marketing and training in the past, probably like 3 years, the tribal connecting services. So my background is not for the academics on here. I wasn't trained like you. I was trained about relationships and stories and identity through all the matriarchs in my line. My grandmother, by her telling, showing me, when people come to your home, you offer them, somewhere to sit, something to eat, something to drink. You create space of safety and community. You make people feel welcome. You make them feel safe. And, I think about my mom, she's also taught me in that, like to little things like following up on your word and including other people, having the hard conversations about truth, and not necessarily agendas. So those are all things that I've taken into my business relationships that really have helped with community engagement. So just a whole different trail of working, I suppose, in overlaps in the same industry. So thank you, Hanke.
Thank you so much, April. That was just lovely, beautiful, heartfelt. As we mentioned before, Dr. Dustin Tahmahkera is in class. We will introduce him more formally when he arrives. But we have developed some questions to help layer in our conversation for this time period. And I have it in 3 sections, and one is kind of basic concepts, or what we might call indigeneity 101, if you've never had to engage with indigenous nations. So one question I'd like to ask of our panelists is to talk about the role of sovereignty in understanding indigenous storytelling. Now, we are not here to give a legal lesson or a history lesson over many centuries, but we do want to base our discussions and understanding kind of some fundamental concepts, and sovereignty is one that is essential. So I'd like to throw that out to our current panelists. April, Candace, what would you advise? Share your thoughts about the role of sovereignty in understanding indigenous storytelling.
Sure. I am happy to start answering that question. I think April made some really salient points in her introduction about, really just tackling sort of the myths and misperceptions of indigenous communities. We are still here, and I apologize, my cat's trying to make its debut on the screen, and I'm like trying to I'm keeping an eye on her, but she's determined. So I think the most important thing is to, yes, again, acknowledge that there are 574 federally recognized tribes. There are way more tribes that have not been federally recognized, but they still have their own ceremonial practices and they have their own languages. And so understanding that you are truly dealing with a community, like April said, that has its own language, that has its own business structure, that has its own cultural norms. Those things all make tribes very unique in the way that their story is told. I mean, the narrative of each tribe is going to vary. And I think it's really important to understand that as a communications professional, if you're working, here in Arizona, I have several colleagues from, PRSA, and have been a member of that organization in our Phoenix chapter. I know that I have some friends who work with agencies that work with tribes because of gaming. The gaming industry is pretty big out here in Arizona. And so it's really important for them to understand that when they're visiting a tribal community, there are cultural norms that you would have to first get adjusted to. And it looks like, the screen was freezing up for a minute. Simple cultural customs, like just acknowledging that, some tribal community members don't feel comfortable meeting your eye gaze. So there's protocols, and it doesn't mean it's disrespectful. Some people might think it's disrespectful, but it's actually just kind of a reverence that we have for one another. In a business setting, you may not always have that same encounter. But just understanding that, you're walking into or onto tribal land, ancestral land, where, people are living and breathing their culture and their history every day, while at the same time walking in the world of, day-to-day business and having jobs and, integrating that into their life as well. So I think that's really important when you're working in communications, to understand that.
Thanks,
April.
Candace. To add on to what Candace shared, I think big picture, the first thing that came to mind was to know that you will never own that story, because it will always belong to the people. If you're writing about a certain group, like if you're collecting any data, for sure, like you'll never own that data. That's part of tribal sovereignty. So just being aware of that. I think that goes back to even sort of checking and taking a pause and kind of inventory and like perspective as you're coming in to these different circles, because it's human nature, like to think like, oh yeah, everyone thinks like me, but we don't. And so when you're working with other tribal organizations or people, if you feel like you're having some assumptions, perhaps in a respectful way, just ask, like I just want to double check, like, a lot of like fact checking. And I think coming in like with respecting that sovereignty is like, I like to say it's a privilege to go on, tribal land, to work with tribal governments and tribal entities. It's not a right. So, come with respect, come correct. And, just like really understanding it's a relationship. And also that thinking about like, again, going back to my grandma's teachings, like when you're coming there, how are you going to make that relationship better than when you first entered it? Because it should not be worse because you entered into that space. So that would be my thoughts on that.
Beautiful and very, very poignant and pointed. We appreciate your sharing. I want to ask another question again, in kind of basically understanding this point about relationships and history. Storytelling, usually through family stories, are often the paths in which African American, Latino, and people of European descent realize a connection or understand their connections to Indigenous peoples. What guidance would you give to those who want to learn more about their own personal heritages where they may or may not connect with Indigenous history? And I see Dustin has joined us, but throw out that, may I, while you were thinking about that, may I take this opportunity to introduce our colleague and other panelist and invite him to say a few words. So Dr. Dustin Tahmahkera, who is my esteemed colleague at the University of Oklahoma, holds the Wick Carey Endowed Chair in Native American Cultural Studies. He has expertise in producing digital media and is also a script writer and voice-over artist, among many other talents and activities. Dustin, might you take a few minutes to introduce yourself and just say a bit about your personal story and how you've arrived to where you are?
Yeah, no, thank you, Maida. In the Namatequap, in the Comanche language, I say ha, Madawika, Nanania sa, Dustin Tahmahkera. It's good to be here with you all. I apologize for running all over the place, but here now and glad to be here with y'all. And you know, what I would briefly say for now is and my head is in a lot of space on curating exhibits right now. I was just in a class workshopping with folks on their projects that, you know, I'm asking them to really not just go write another research paper or do something like that, but to you know, it's an art class. It's called Creative Natives, and we are curating exhibits. And I told them, you know, like I want y'all to move toward justice. You know, I tend to say toward justice because it can be elusive and it can be very debatable about, you know, if we ever really fully arrive to a sense of justice. And so I told them, you know, let's move toward justice this semester, and let's do that in the form of your research and your exhibits, working with Native artists, having Native-centric exhibits, doing this work like what folks have been talking about on Indigenous voices in storytelling. And I tell them, you know, like, let's work on curating connections and building relationships. And that's like a guide for, I feel like, for a lot of us, of how we move about, of networking, connecting with folks, like whether it's virtually in these spaces or in person, or even imagining, you know, through the creative works that we might come up with, and really trying to curate these connections, trying to build relationships that are grounded in accountability, that really help to that just help to show, like, you know, who we are and where we come from, because that's some of the foundational questions that I've learned from aunties and from kakus or grandmas, and just, you know, being ready to always be accountable to your ancestral teachings, and to know that whatever we say, even like as I'm speaking only for myself here, it doesn't mean that I can just say whatever I want. It's still, you know, I hope, you know, humbly, it's something that whatever I say will be accountable to the teachings that I've received. And so when we put relations together and we put accountable together, like as relational accountability, that's just a guiding framework, and that just leads me to like what it is I'm trying to do. And, you know, whether I'm doing some kind of individual project, or especially when doing collaborative work, and whether working with students or working with, you know, folks back home with Comanche Nation and others, to see, you know, what it is what we can build up, and making sure that, you know, Native voices are part of the center of the conversations, like I think has probably been happening here. But again, I'll just kind of go with that for now. Thank you, Maida.
And thank you so much, Dustin. And now that we've warmed up, I'm Maida, Dustin, Candace, April. We know our titles. We can put them aside for now and just have a real conversation. But just to finish out this kind of idea of basic understanding of indigeneity, you came in on this last question, and I just would like some input to share with others in this space who believe or understand that they have a connection with Indigenous communities through family stories, but want to learn more, either to verify or to debunk it. And we have seen in public spaces and politics and academia where people have claimed Indigenous identity, and maybe it has been misrepresented. So what things, what advice might you just share quickly and generally about sorting that out for those who are not enrolled, but believe that they have some connection or are interested in exploring that?
Is that for everyone or?
That's for everyone, but
Okay, just to make
Dustin,
sure.
you want to get started?
Oh, sure. Now, yeah, and no, and good to see you, Candace, and good to meet you, April. And again, thanks to Anitra and to Brittany for helping, make these spaces possible, and wanting this to be part of the dialogue here. I come from a tribe where the way I've been taught is that, we all have medicine. We all, in the sense of, we call it puha, or like our strengths, our talents. And I think back to my teen angst years, and and just like all over the place. I'm like, what is it? What's the meaning of this and that? And and you get older, and gray hairs that are hiding under my cap and all that. And so, but there's this idea that we all have something to contribute, and we're all on a path. And so, I've run into, especially when I travel throughout Texas, I've met a whole lot of folks who claim to be Comanche or feel like there's some kind of Comanche connection. And, I think sometimes there's some really genuine things happening there. And so it's trying to, in those moments, I'll ask them, like, well, who might, is there a certain ancestor of, do you have a name? And just trying to point them, trying to listen. I'm cool with, being patient and trying to listen to where they're coming from and what they're trying to figure out. And, I remember when I taught at University of Texas years ago, a number of students who, would identify as Latinx and were coming in and saying they knew they had Apache ancestry or a Comanche ancestry, and it made sense with being in the borderlands down there. And they were trying to figure out more of that. And some of them just mention it and move on. Others, really stick around and want to build community and build relationships, folks that I'm still in touch with today. And I think that's just part of the bottom line, is trying to see like where they're coming from and where they're trying to go with this, in hopefully in ethical and good ways. And I also, come from a people who we have captured with historical narratives of captivity. That's part of how we built up who we are. And to this day, we still know some of our folks who come from captivity, and who and even see it play out in more recent forms in playful and serious ways, like when my auntie LaDonna Harris, elder there in Albuquerque and longtime political rights activist, Indigenous activist, she's going strong in her 90s now. And, a few years ago, she didn't just adopt Johnny Depp when he was playing a Tonto, Comanche version of Tonto. She told me, she's like, I want to do like Comanche women would have done back in the day. We're going to go capture Johnny Depp. And it was smart. She took heat for it, but it was really smart of what she was doing. She was capturing him and building up some of our cultural capital back in that day. So there's a lot of history to take into account of where we're coming from. And I think very tribal specific histories that can play out with all of this.
I love that, Dustin. And I have to say, as a Hopi woman, any knowledge of what Hopi history and culture is like is we're known as the peaceful tribe. We come in peace. We're very loving. We're very accepting. My so'o is what I call my grandma in Hopi. She just always taught me to give back to my community. And so I try to live that legacy through her. And I think I would say that I'm not really in the business of policing culture in a way. Obviously, any cultural appropriation is inappropriate. And I mean, I would stand against anything that is coming off as inauthentic. But that's not necessarily like my priority. What I would say is that as speaking to a non-native, I would just invite you to look in your own backyard for Indigenous led activities and events, and really understand that we're all connected in that way. There's so much more that unites us than separates us. And if you just really wanted to learn authentically what it is for someone to be Indigenous in your own community, you can go to those events that are happening in your town and celebrate and see the culture and just experience it, to know and to feel that. It's a feeling that you will walk away with. And it's really based off of us being our authentic selves as Native people. So I'm not sure necessarily how I would answer that question other than to say that, we're still here. Our culture is still alive. We're still making history. We're still reaching these milestones for our communities. So you should, feel invited to come out and experience that. When it's appropriate, of course. There are ceremonial traditions and practices on Hopi that, aren't necessarily for non-Native community members. So, but also, that's something that you can just kind of have a general awareness about and understanding when approaching that.
Thank you. April, is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think it depends on what, there's kind of different ways to slice this question and different perspectives, because, I guess what I heard was like someone who was trying to find out if they were Native or looking into that. Is that what you said, or am I totally misinterpreting what your question was?
It's however you interpret it, whatever strikes your spirit, speak to it.
Because the first thing that came to mind for me is like, talk to your people, relationships begin with your family. And, like if whoever your oldest living family member is, the story keeper, talk to them and just say like, hey, I have an interest. I heard one time, like I thought it was Wallapai, or I thought it was Hopi, or I thought I was Choctaw, and ask them. Because a lot of times, and I've noticed this in families, it's like the stories don't come out until that story keeper passes away. And then they're like, oh, I remember, like he sang salt songs, but now our salt songs are gone. Okay, well, why don't we record it? Oh yeah, because we don't record it. But remember that time we said we could and we should have. But so I believe start with your own family and have that conversation. If you have interest, you can always Google whatever that tribe is and like try to find the tribal office, and there's probably going to be an enrollment office. I think if you really have that in your heart, and you don't have family that are connected in that way, and you want to reconnect, if you think there is that connection, that's a starting point. But I also think too, if we take a higher level view of that, of Indigenous identity, is like, you don't have to be federally recognized. You don't have, like, to me, that goes back to sovereignty. Like, I'll just share with my tribe, this went to ballot probably like maybe less than 5 years ago. So in my tribe, Wallapai, you need to be able to prove your 25% blood quantum of Wallapai blood. I think we're the only two-leggeds that have to prove who we are. The four-leggeds, there's pedigrees and all that. They have their documentation too. So it came up to vote, amongst our tribal people. They wanted to reform our tribal constitution, even if it got enough votes, was like, how are we going to identify, who is Wallapai? And so it was like, the options were, poof, everybody who's enrolled now, you're 100% Wallapai. Another one was, let's drop it. We can all do math. So let's go from a quarter to an eighth. And then I think the other option was like to keep it the same. Why I shared this is because it has to do with identity, right? And how we see ourselves. And for this reason, I love social media, because on like different Facebook groups of the community, that became the hot topic. And just to hear, of the tribal members, like, what does it mean to be Wallapai? And the thought that came to mind for me is like, nobody made me Wallapai, so nobody can take it away. I am Wallapai. So then you like slice it, okay, but there's benefits, right, of being Wallapai. So then I think that's another question to ask of people, like, are you doing it from like you want to, like the community, you want to have like the identity part, or are you doing it for like benefits? Because that's a whole different topic. So those are just my thoughts on the topic.
Thank you very much,
Mhm.
all of you, for giving us some great perspectives. And I think we want to, I hope everyone is thinking of their own questions as we continue this conversation. We're going to just flip now to applying these concepts to professional contexts and apply them to real world settings. And so we just have a few questions we'll discuss as a panel, and then we are going to open it up to you. So let's begin by thinking about the functions of PR, marketing, advertising, storytelling. In what ways are they different when the agencies are engaging with sovereign nations? In what ways are they the same? Another way to think of this might be a day in the life of public relations, marketing, advertising, when you work with sovereign Indian nations, when you work with non-Indian nations. What's similar, what's different? So jump in there.
I'm happy to tackle that, because one of my first jobs when I got back to Arizona in 2012 was working with the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community. And I would say that it really depends on the resources that the tribe has. So if you're working with a tribal community and they have a lot of resources, they may have a community relations office with a media relations role. They may have no resources, and then you're wearing multiple hats as a public information officer. So you're learning about emergency management if something were to happen on a tribal community. You're taking on media relations. So you're working with the local and state media outlets to try and make sure things are correct in the media, and that important information that the tribe is doing with programs and different initiatives and or tribal laws that affect surrounding communities. So for example, the Salt River Indian community imposed a no text while you're on tribal land, but the land is very prominently nestled alongside the city of Scottsdale. And so you have a lot of people who travel on tribal land for any given period of time during their work commute. Well, they would need to know that, when they're on the tribal land, they can't text. They can be pulled over, they can be given a citation. And so some of that work falls on the shoulders of media relations specialists when they're working for a tribal community. Also, again, just being a representative and being a liaison, sort of building the bridge and the communication and connection from a tribal government to an entity like a water utility company or, any kind of like a public service type position. And I've done that as well. And so you're talking more like stakeholder relations, where you're doing a lot of community outreach. You're engaging tribes to share resources about different programs that may impact their tribal community. And in what ways can you bring those tribes that are going to be impacted to the table so that you can kind of establish some authentic transparency in your communication and your tactics when you're moving forward with any kind of campaign that you might be working on that's going to impact tribes.
Thank you. Dustin, April, you're not required, but if you have something that you want to add, please feel free to share.
One thing, a client project came to mind, and it was a launch for one of their hospitals. And I think if you're working with tribes, to recognize and ask, like where they're at, like I've heard, flyers are dead, it's all digital or what have you. But in working with this community, they had 7 districts, and one of the hot spots to get information is Crossroads, and they actually have like huge billboards, not like a community board where people still put up posters. So I guess just knowing or not knowing, but kind of what works for like mainstream America, I would just not automatically apply it to whatever tribal client you may have, because it's definitely not going to be a one size fits all. So there's those different things to think about. And then the other part I would say in working with our clients is to do some check-ins about what is acceptable to, like, not even just words, but like also images, video, pictures, because like with one client, we found out, even though it's okay for perhaps like males from their community to use this symbol, but it is not okay for, and being a woman-owned company, it wasn't okay for us to use that symbol. And that's a cultural thing that we found out, during our discussions. And the other part you might find out too is even amongst the tribal community, they may not have consensus on that topic, because then that became a whole issue even amongst themselves. And just my personal advice on that would always be to just be respectful that you're a guest and in that and not kind of push your own viewpoints or agendas. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I'm along those lines when April mentioned, with video and images, and I think back like Navajo Nation, Hopis, have long had, and the points of contact, of elected officials and, preservation office. And like, we're, if you're really respecting tribal sovereignty, then like, when a film crew, and I, think about work, with film consulting and things like that as a film and media scholar, really supposed to, go through, those entities, those official entities and talking with those folks and before any kind of filming. Right. And I think like, with our own Comanche Nation Historic Preservation Office, like them and our tribal administrator are major points of contact, but not everybody will go that route. It's interesting when watching like how the filming on lands and things that some people will do, like sometimes I think there's film crews, especially like some non-native crews, who think that they just need one person's permission, from, and it could be someone who is a citizen of that nation, may not be a citizen of the nation. There's all these complicated politics that go with it. And sometimes folks, there'll be film crews who think, well, I need to go talk to the, the business council, the chairman and the ones who are elected. And sometimes those folks really do have good interests of the people in mind. Sometimes the elected leaders are like certain other politicians where it's like, that's not who I want speaking on my behalf, And so it can get pretty thorny and complicated on that. But when I've done independent work, as just like someone who is contacted to do consulting for a film project, something about Comanches, before I'll even look at a script or anything, it's listening to them. And again, trying to see where they're coming from. I remember, and some of them, they just come in and say, well, we want this to be authentic, and it's almost like, are they just checking boxes, and like, I'm a Comanche who can tell them Comanche stuff and therefore they're good to go. It's like, there's been more things I've turned down than I've said yes to, because it didn't feel right. It was, mentioned earlier about a feeling and trusting, that feeling of like, yeah, I think this is about profit for them. This is about, how to advance their careers. And is this really about Comanches, or is this going to be just more ideas about Comanches, that they have? So, I will say, like with the Hulu film Prey that came out and received all these really good reviews, they really tried to work with Comanches, and my auntie and I were the first ones contacted for that film project, where you got a Comanche versus this humanoid predator. It was like, okay, like that's different, let's give it a go. And I think it turned out pretty well, but like they contacted us probably 5 years ago, way before this pandemic thing. And at the time, I think it was called Skulls, and it was this really dark project. And I was like, wow. But, I especially listened to, because they came to me first, and I said, well, you've got a Comanche woman, young Comanche woman at the center of this film. I was like, you have to have a Comanche elder and woman, as a consultant. And so it was revealing to me that they were so receptive to my auntie coming on board. She had just, been consulting for AMC television show The Sun with Pierce Brosnan and Zahn McLaren and different folks. And so she's got more street cred anyway in so many ways, but they really listened to her. And that was part of what my role was like making sure that they were respectful and receptive. And they were, and that went a long ways, and it formed this longer term kind of relationship that we still have, with those folks who helped put together PRSA. And so that's also something of a rare kind of example that I could draw from personally, but glad that it panned out the way it did. Again, building relationships and thinking back to my Kaku and our family, Grandma Anna. She just passed on earlier this year at age 104. And I remember her telling me once that, back in decades ago when she was in the nursing profession, after she had served in the war as like a welder, then she was a nurse for our tribe and working in healthcare. And she said what she did first was she went to every family that she could and just sat down and had coffee and visited with them. And it's just this old way that I just think is great of just that kind of model of just listening and seeing what their needs are and what she can do to intervene on their behalf with the tribe.
Thank you so much. This is amazing. We have had this conversation. We're almost at the end of our time, our allotted time, but this has been so rich, and we know we have heard themes about relationships, the importance of building relationships, of listening, and of showing respect. In our remaining moments, I wanted to invite our audience if there are any more questions for the panelists. If so, now is the time to share. And
Major, I have a question that I would
please.
like to ask the panelists as we wrap up. And that is the question of, when you think of all that has gone on, your individual histories, the histories of Indigenous peoples across this nation, what do you think is missing in storytelling? To bring it back to our topic of Indigenous voices in storytelling, what do you think we need to work on as we move forward? Because this is not a history alone. It's the present and it's the future. So what do you think is missing? What should we be teaching in classrooms? What we should prepare students, the future marketers and PR professionals and consultants in film and media? What is missing?
Yeah, I've got a great example of how to work with tribes. I co-own a gallery space. It's the first Indigenous women-led, women-owned gallery space in downtown Phoenix. And through our work over the past year, we've come into contact with the Phoenix Suns, the NBA basketball team for our hometown. Last night, we just celebrated the first Native American Recognition Day night. And what they did was they hired more natives. They hired digital creative designers who made a digital experience inside the arena. They hired my company to help with media pitching, getting the word out to our tribal media outlets, to write a story on their blog. They hired another one of our board members on the Indigenous Peoples Public Relations Association. They hired her to come and talk about the importance of DEI initiatives, right? But also offering sort of that cultural context and working with all of the like Intertribal Council of Arizona and all 22 tribes to really not just put us on display, but provide an education, an experience for the people who attended the game last night. And they have been working on that project for over 2.5 years. They explained the significance of the uniform and the different emblems. And this is at a time when, you know, youth are seeing this on TV, and they're also seeing the downside of people appropriating and using mascots in really terrible ways. But what the Phoenix Suns were able to do with us, with our companies, and for the Indigenous community last night was to really raise us up in a way that gave us a lot of sense of pride, but also helped non-natives experience and learn something about all of the 22 tribes that are in the state of Arizona last night. And it's not just a one-time gig for the Suns. They're actually taking this and they're gonna have, they call it the Originative Nights. That's a branded program from our creative director at Cahokia. And they're having 10 of them. And then they're also taking it on the road to like Oklahoma and or Minnesota, Wisconsin, where they've got a high population of Indigenous communities. So I think if any company, business, entity, organization were to look at that, at the work that the Phoenix Suns did, that's a blueprint for how to work with tribal communities. So my hat's off to them. My heart is just filling with so much happiness, pride, and just respect and appreciation for how well they treated us. And it's, I mean, it's all over the news. So you guys come follow us on our Instagrams, me and April. I'm at Hello Badger PR on Instagram, and I was there at the stadium last night to watch and to receive all of that. It was amazing.
Awesome. Well, we're at the top of the hour and the end of our time together. And again, I would just like to thank Dustin, April, Candace, and Meta for being here and having this excellent conversation. And thank all of you for joining us today. As we close, and I sit here and join you from Marietta, California, land that was originally settled by tribes known to us as the Sioux, Cherokee, and Iroquois, I recognize that I am privileged. I am here because of colonization, but I'm also here because the tribes allow me to be by honoring the treaties, congressional acts, and executive orders in place. Our privilege is not past, it is present, and it is the future. And it is important to recognize the origin and current state of being. I encourage you all to learn more about the people and the history and the culture of where you are. I hope to see you all our next session on January the 26th, 2023. And again, I thank you all for being here. I also thank PRSA Educators Academy for being great partners, and also University of Texas at Austin Moody College of Communication for being our sponsor. Have a great rest of your week and happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you.